video. Welcome to our, here we go. Everyone's joining us again. Welcome to our webinar on migration using the longitudinal studies. The little windows that are hopefully popping up there are our speakers for today, Miles Gould, Martin Van Ham and Ian Shuttleworth. I'll give a wave. So the plan is that in a moment I'll give a brief introduction to the longitudinal studies and Calls Hub. And then we'll have presentations from each of our speakers about things that they've done. And then hopefully at the end we'll have some time for questions and answers. You'll see there is a chat window there. If you're having any problems or if you have any questions, if you could put them in there. We won't answer the questions until the question and answer session though, but you can write them in there at any time if you want. Okay, so I think it's nearly 2 o'clock, so we will begin. So. If the other presenters want to mute themselves, that'd be great. Now I will just bring up my presentation. Okay. So, first of all, I'm going to give you a quick introduction to the UK census-based longitudinal studies. My name is Fiona Cox. I'm based at the University of St Andrews and I'm the project manager for Calls Hub. Now, Calls Hub, I should say initially, we exist to sort of promote the 3 UK census longitudinal studies. So in the UK we have 3 longitudinal studies. The Scottish longitudinal study, maintained by the SLS DSU, the Northern Ireland Longitudinal Study, or NILS, which is supported by the NILS RSU, and the ONS LS for England and Wales, which is supported for academic researchers by Celsius at UCL. And as I say, Calls Hub exists to promote the 3 longitudinal studies and spread the word about them, like this webinar we're doing today. So the 3 studies are similar in that they use census data and administrative data. They all have slight differences as well. So we have different sampling fractions here. So for England and Wales, it's 1%. Scotland, we have 5%. Northern Ireland, 28%. But as you can see, we do have quite large sample sizes. At 2011, we had 580,000 people, for example, in England and Wales as members of the ONS-LS. So each LS contains complete census data for study members, and to be a study member it's based on random, very secret birth dates. So people who move into the country or who are born between censuses who have a birth date that falls on one of those secret dates will be automatically flagged and brought into the longitudinal study. As well as census data, each study also contains administrative data. So the ONS-LS has births, deaths, widowhoods, stillbirths, and we have flags for immigration and emigration from the country, some minor health events and cancer data. And I should also say that we also have household information for people living with study LS members, although we don't follow them across time, so it may be different people within the household across time. So the Scottish longitudinal study contains births, deaths, marriages, and also has additional linkages to, for example, education data, which is very useful if you're looking at effects on education for socioeconomic status and things. And we also have linkage ability to vast NHS health data in Scotland, which is really, really good stuff. And basically we have prescriptions, we have all kinds of hospital episodes, maternity data, psychiatric admissions, cancer data, etc. Northern Ireland similarly has births, deaths, marriages, and they also have excellent links to health data in Northern Ireland. One extra thing that they do have as well is property data, and Scotland and Northern Ireland also have very good postcode data, which is updated regularly, which means you don't have to rely on the postcodes from one census to the next for the 10-year period. You can now also look at more continuous patterns of migration between the censuses. The lowest geographies available to researchers differ slightly for the LSs. In Scotland, you're allowed a data zone, which is approximately 500 to 1,000 people. In Northern Ireland, it's a super output area, which is around 2,000 people. And in England and Wales, it's local authority level or groupings, smaller groupings to equivalent size. The data itself does actually contain data right down to postcode, even to grid reference level, but researchers aren't allowed to see that for privacy reasons. But the staff can use that if you need to link in other data or you need to create your own variables from it. They can do that for you and create a derived variable. So longitudinal analysis has some advantages over cross-sectional studies. It adds the dimension of time, and it allows you to examine the effect of policies and changes in personal and environmental situations and the effect that that has on other aspects of people's lives. And obviously it allows you better to establish causality because you know which comes first. You can think about longitudinal analysis in terms of a Lexis diagram like this. So along the bottom axis here we have the dates, and along the vertical axis we have age. So this line here would represent someone who was born in 1950, and you can see here from the vertical dashes that for the England and Wales LS we have census data at each of these time points, 1971, 81, when they were respectively 22, 32, 42, etc. And you, as well as the censuses, in between censuses we have births and marriages and other information that comes in. So you can see already it builds up quite a rich picture. So you can look at people born at different times, or you could look at, for example, in this last little line here, sorry, it's quite pale, people who are a certain age who move into the region. So for example, this is someone who was age 20 at 1991. You may want to look at them. You may want to look at people who are a certain age in 1971, or you may want to, you can cut this in different directions if you see what I mean. You can imagine that you would take different samples from this diagram. So for migration research, we have a lot of key variables. For example, we have address on census night, 1 year before census. We have distance of move between census. At 2011, we have the year of most recent arrival. We have country of birth, and we also have addresses from vital events and health registrations. And other variables can also be correlated with migration, which is the beauty of the richness of the data. So you have occupation, economic activity, social class, household composition, identity, self-reported ethnicity, education, housing tenure, deprivation, and lots more. To access the data, the LSs are free to use, and researchers are welcome from academia, including research students, government policy groups, and third sector organisations. If you're a researcher from another organisation or from overseas, you should get in touch with us just to discuss access, because there may be some slight changes to how you access the data. Because of the sensitive nature of the data, as you can appreciate from seeing what the LSs contain, they're very sensitive. Because of that, the LSs can only be accessed within designated safe setting rooms. So for the SLS, that's based in Edinburgh. In Northern Ireland, that's in Belfast. And for the England and Wales LS, it's accessible in the VMLs in London, Titchfield and Newport. So to use the data, you actually have to physically travel to these safe settings. We have recently begun in Scotland, and they're hopefully soon trialling in England, synthetic data sets which allow you to get a synthetic version of your data, so you can work in your office on building your models and your syntax, and then you go to the safe setting to save some time, so you can run it finally on the real data. That's something quite new that's being rolled out. So researchers are required to complete an application process, and they undergo training before they access the LSs. And you can get information on all the steps involved on our website. So there's lots of information on our website. We have a data dictionary where you can explore all the data variables that are held in all three LSs. You can compare LSs. You can even save your own little list of variables to download or to come back to at a later point. We have an outputs database where you can browse through all different kinds of outputs from books and journals and presentations and posters and things that have been produced. We have news and events, and we also have research briefs and summaries and impact case studies, just to give smaller sort of snapshot views of research with the LSs. So you can get in touch with us for more information at calls.ac.uk. You can follow us on Twitter, calls_hub, and email us at info@calls.ac.uk. Now I'm going to hand over now to Martin van Ham from Delft University. Just bear with me 1 second. And okay.
You can hear me?
Martin, yes, I can hear you. Okay. So,
I cannot see my presentation. Okay, you should be able to see my my presentation as well now. Okay, well, thank you very much for being here. I can see there's several people in the audience. It's a bit strange not to be able to look at anyone, but to look at my own camera, actually to look at myself. My name is Martin van Ham. I'm a professor of geography and a professor of urban studies in Delft, University of Technology in the Netherlands. But I'm also a professor of geography in St Andrews in Scotland. And many years ago, I was one of the first, together with David Manley, who's also here on the opening slide of my presentation, Ellen Findlay and Peter Kefeiten, to work with the SLS data. And at that time, there were only 2 waves of the Scottish longitudinal data available. And well, we were one of the first to work with this data, and we decided to look at the relationship between occupational mobility, basically whether people do better over time in terms of their work career, and longer distance migration within Scotland. So we were interested in primarily in 2 dimensions of this relationship between social mobility and spatial mobility. The first one was a more regional dimension, where the literature suggests that within Scotland, those people living in Edinburgh are the most likely to do well in the labour market. And I'll come back to that in a second. So basically, the place where you live and the place where you work has an effect on your labour career. And the second dimension was a migration dimension, where the literature very clearly suggests that migrants are more likely to do better than people who do not move over longer distances. Well, these 2 elements strongly relate to this idea of the escalator effect. I can't even remember where this figure comes from, but it illustrates the idea nicely that the escalator effect, or the escalator region effect, is basically an effect of young people, often single, moving to cities for higher education, for the start of their career, the jobs they want. Then while living in the city, they progress their career, they get better jobs, higher incomes, and towards the end of their career, they leave the escalator and leave the city and move to more rural areas, a little bit further away from the city. And the question we had for Scotland was whether in Scotland, Edinburgh, Glasgow particularly, are serving like regional escalators, because most of the literature on these escalator regions focuses on large metropolitan regions like London or Paris or New York. And we were interested in whether such an escalator effect is also relevant in more regional capitals. Well, we looked at, there's actually a working paper available on this paper, so I can only show you a little bit of the outcomes, a few of the outcomes, but if you look at the reasons for migration, and this of course is not from the longitudinal study data, but from a survey. But if you look at reasons for migration to Scotland, then you see that those who were living in Scotland but were born in England, almost 73% of them moved for employment reasons. And those who are Scottish and moving within Scotland over long distances, almost 40%, 38% moved over longer distances for employment reasons. So employment reasons are really important, a really important explanation for these longer distance moves. Thinking about Edinburgh as a regional escalator, the questions we had were well, if Edinburgh is an escalator region within Scotland, providing all these opportunities for upward mobility. So basically, if you move from the rest of Scotland to Edinburgh, are you more likely than others to do well in your labour career? Are you likely to get a better job? And if so, then it could be that also those moving to Edinburgh and living in Edinburgh experience more upward mobility. And to some extent, we also expected similar effects for Glasgow. People living in Glasgow and people moving to Glasgow over longer distances do better than those people moving within the rest of Scotland or moving to other smaller cities in Scotland. Well, as said, we used the Scottish Longitudinal study, and to some extent this is a bit of a historical talk, because this is a study we conducted in 2010-11. So we used the SLS, a 5.3% sample of the Scottish population. At the time where we used the data, we were able to use the 91 and 2001 data sets, which were linked together, so we could follow the same people from 91 to 2001, including information on people's socioeconomic characteristics, demographic characteristics, etc., etc. And crucially, we could follow people over the full 10-year period. The dependent variable in our study was occupational mobility between 91 and 2001, based on the socioeconomic classification. And basically, we collapsed the socioeconomic categories into those with a high occupational status and a low occupational status. And we excluded those who were self-employed. So basically, our interest was in those moving from low to higher occupational status jobs and the other way around, and how this socioeconomic mobility is related to spatial mobility. Well, if you look at the population born in Scotland here, I don't know whether you can see what I'm doing with the pen here, but if you those born in Scotland, then you can see that those who did not move, about 17% of that group experienced mobility from a low to a higher occupational status, while those who moved over longer distances, 37% experienced social mobility. And if you look at those who were born originally in England, you see even stronger effects of moving. Those who didn't move over longer distance or didn't move at all, 25% experienced social mobility, while those who moved over longer distances, it's almost 50%. So we can see two things in this table. First, a difference between those born in Scotland and those born in England. Those born in England are more likely to experience upward social mobility, upward occupational mobility. And second, we find that longer distance moves are related to more occupational mobility. The born in England effect is probably explained by the fact that those who were born in England and moved to Scotland are a selective group of people who are more oriented towards occupational mobility. They're more likely to do well in the labour market because it's a selective group. Well, you're not supposed to see all the details here, but we did lots of modeling work trying to make the best use of all the information available in the longitudinal study. And the most important effects are summarized here in the next graph. So basically, we looked at the probability that people move from low to higher occupational status groups between 91 and 2001. And we clearly saw from the data that those born in England and Wales are more likely to experience this upward occupational mobility compared to the reference group, which is those who were born in Scotland. But we didn't really find large differences between those who were born outside the UK and those who were born in England or Wales. So in other words, people from outside the UK, those from England and Wales and the rest of the world, are more likely to experience occupational mobility than those born in Scotland. And like I said, this is most likely to be a selection effect, where migrants are more likely to be focused on their labor career and therefore do better. But our main interest was in the effect of moving, and also the effect of moving from and between different cities. So first of all, we compared those who didn't move between 91 and 2001, those who moved over a short distance, and those who moved over longer distances. And the bluish bars are the probability that people move to a higher occupational status. And you can see that as the moving distance increases, people are more likely to do well. So those who move over longer distances, also in Scotland, are more likely to experience upward occupational mobility. But interestingly, if you look at the group where nobody moved, you see that those who live in Edinburgh and those who live in Glasgow are most likely to do well in the sense that they are most likely to experience upward mobility. If you look at the group that moved over a short distance, you can see that those moving towards Edinburgh are the most likely to do well. And if you look at those who moved over longer distances in Scotland, well, there's a very clear and very large Edinburgh effect. And there's not much difference between moving to other types of cities in Glasgow. So basically, also in Scotland, if you move over longer distances, you're more likely to do well in your labour career. And especially those moving to Edinburgh are likely to experience upward socioeconomic mobility, here measured by looking at occupational status. So in that sense, we confirmed the escalator region effect for Scotland, and we confirmed that also sort of regional capitals like Edinburgh can function as an escalator region within a country. So a short summary. Those who migrate over longer distances within or to Scotland are the most likely to achieve upward occupational mobility. So there's a relationship between longer distance moves and doing well in the labour market. Those born outside Scotland were most likely to experience greater occupational mobility on average compared to those born within Scotland. And that's most likely a selection effect. People who move to Scotland from England and from the rest of the world are a selective group. And finally, Edinburgh in Scotland is by far the most important regional escalator. And this, especially the time we did this project, was an important finding because all of the literature on these escalator effects focuses on very large international megacities. And we were one of the first to look at the escalator effect for smaller regional capitals. And then final slide, some acknowledgements to the SLS team and the data we used. So thank you very much, and back to Fiona. Fiona.
Thank you very much, Martin. That was really interesting. Thank you. And if anyone has any questions for Martin, you can start typing them in now, or you can save them and type them in at the end. There will be a chance to ask. Okay, our next speaker is Ian Shuttleworth. So just close that one. So I'll hand over to Ian. Ian is based at Queen's University Belfast and is actually director of the NILS Research Support Unit. And he's going to present some work that he did with Tony Champion using the England and Wales longitudinal study on whether we're becoming more or less migratory over time. Thank you, Ian.
Okay, thank you. The genesis of this presentation started out with some work that Tom Cook did that showed that migration, internal migration and moves had fallen in the United States really from the late 1960s. And he explained that part by this being one of the characteristics of an advanced society, secular rootedness. So that actually got me thinking, and I got Tony Champion involved, and we wondered we'd see the same patterns over here in England and Wales, in a country which had been through roughly the same sorts of changes in terms of demography and roughly the same labour market and occupational and educational changes. Obviously there's some differences, but the broad same trajectories. So would we see the same here? So the work started out with that simple question, and it's led to 3 papers in population, space and place, one which is going through some revisions now, but 2 which are already being published, and also an edited book. What I'm going to talk about today really draws on the second paper we published, Population, Space and Place. First of all, here are the usual disclaimers and thanks. So thanks for the support that we receive from Celsius, and thanks to ONS and DSRC for supporting access to the data. And of course, we're responsible for the interpretation, so any mistakes or anything else down to us and not the people who produce the data or help us get access to it. So, a little bit of background. I gave you some of the sort of background there about what drew us into this topic. But just go a little bit further back. A lot of social science theory assumes that entities have got more mobile through time. Obviously, there's all sorts of mobilities. There's daily mobilities, weekly mobilities, work-related mobilities, mobilities of different things and substances and information and so on. But it had been assumed that as part of the suite of increasing mobilities, that people got more mobile in terms of change of address, in terms of where they live, in terms of internal migration. However, as I said earlier, the evidence from the United States suggested that longer distance migration rates had decreased over the longer term. And in fact, as well, to add to that, more recent evidence suggests that all types of move overall in the United States. And this seems to be a combination of changes in the composition of the population. So, for example, older people don't move very much compared to younger people. And with a greater proportion of older people in the population, you therefore expect mobility to decrease overall. But also rate effects, where people simply weren't moving as far, weren't going as far, and they weren't moving as often. So a combination of changing population composition and rate effects, e.g. behavioural change. Now, in the first paper we did, we used health card data, and that showed no long-term decline in interregional migration rates for England and Wales from the mid-1970s to 2011. But it only dealt with migration over a certain distance threshold. So in the second paper that we did, which came out last year, and the references are at the end of the presentation, is the ONS-LS to look at changes over a longer time frame, but more importantly, over all distance bands. So looking at the NHS data, that looked at moves between regions, broad areas. But using the ONS-LS, it's possible to look at changes in addresses over all distance bands. So that's quite important, a good reason to use that particular data source. So that's the background sort of done. This is where I'm going to sort of move through here, just basically talk about some of the data, talk about some of the theoretical perspectives, and then present you some results and some interpretations. And of course, there are limitations, and some of the next steps I'll briefly mention as well. So, as I said earlier, much of the social theory, globalization, new mobilities paradigm, assumes that migration, mobility, and so on will increase over the long term because of social and economic changes. I mean, there's been a very long-lasting relationship between modernity and migration. We see that, for example, in the theory of Zelinsky, looking at the mobility transition hypothesis, with increasing mobility, increasing migration at different stages of socio-economic development from traditional to advanced societies. So maybe in this 5th stage, maybe migration might be replaced by other abilities, such as circulation, perhaps long-distance commuting, or so on, and maybe a little bit more of that later. Furthermore, more empirically, at a lower level, we would expect higher levels of education, higher attainment, more people with degrees, more people in white-collar jobs would increase migration, internal migration structurally. But are these assumptions warranted? Are populations in our societies becoming mobile in terms of internal migration or not? Let's just look very brief at some international experiences. Well, I've almost said in this, with the United States, the clear answer is no, because there's been a fall in migration, internal migration there. Is actually true, Canada and Australia, and indeed for some other countries in the book, in our book that came out earlier this year. So in England and Wales, using the NHSCR data, there was no evidence of a longer term decline in longer distance. So that sort of thing quite interesting. Of course, we're not saying, I suppose, that societies are overall less mobile, because obviously there's a lot more international movement and transnational labour. And maybe housing moves, internal migration address changes have been replaced by other types of mobility, perhaps. So, we can't do those hypotheses out and those ideas out. If we do so, there's a risk of throwing out with the bathwater. Is the NHS correct? Well, first of all, yes, it seems fine, but it doesn't capture the whole picture. What about the trends in shorter distance migration? So this is where the ONS-LS comes in, and it's got many advantages. So let's just look at the data, first of all. So why did we use this data set? Why did we use the ONS-LS? First of all, 365th of the population, but it's much bigger than a lot of other surveys, a lot of other data sources. It's got a lot more people in it. There's very little attrition. There's a high level of person linkage between censuses. It goes back further than the NHSCR dataset, e.g. back to 1971. Also as well, there's a lot more detailed geography, so we can look at moves over different distances, things of address, moves over different, right? So that's quite important. And unlike the NHS, which only had data on age and sex, there's a lot of stuff on other individual personal characteristics. And these can be made fairly consistent over time. And because it's microdata and we can work visual cases, you can actually do quite a lot with the data, albeit often sometimes under the challenging conditions of using the BML, which in my case is basically quite challenging because it means going from Bells to London and swinging off like the data source. But there are challenges as well, so let's just look at some of those. So the variable set isn't consistent through time. So for example, we only get ethnicity from 1991 onwards. Variables as well, even if questions asked every census, they do change in the way they're coded, in the way they're asked. So for example, education changes quite frequently between censuses. So actually in our analysis, the best we could do was to look at people with degrees versus those without degrees. There are other issues to take account of as well, so different population bases. So for example, students in 2001 and 2011 were counted in a different place to where they were counted in 1971, 81 and 991 in terms of term time addresses as compared with home address. Different spatial referencing practices in 1971, 1981, 1991, 2001 and 2011 meant we had to take care in how we used the data and how we measured a move, what time periods that we used. And finally, it was only possible for us to measure migration. Was somebody in the same place at the end of a decade as at the start of a decade? But of course, people might move multiple times during a decade, and of course, we couldn't pick those up. So that is something that can now be done with the SLS and NILS because there's updatable information on where people live with sort of downloads, I think in the case every 6 months. I was not doing this. So there's the first question. I'm going to try to answer these three questions. Has the 10-year change of address rate increased or decreased? And how far the by distance have moved? Well, as you might guess from what I've said, it's going to go down. And this is in fact what we see. So starting out in 1981, 55% of people in our study changed address during here. Now, the key points to note are that in this case, in England and Wales, it seems the bulk of the decrease is in distance moves of 10 kilometres or less. And the percentage, the proportion of people moving 10 to 50 or longer distances are roughly the same. So that sort of bears out the analysis that was done in the first paper in PSP using the NH seem to stay fairly constant. But fewer people are moving in changing address now in England and Wales in the past decade than in 1971 to 81. There's a smaller people moving 10 kilometres. On 63% of people who were divorced at the start of the decade moved during the decade, as compared to 43.5% of people in 2001 to 2011. And we can see that there's a general decrease among a lot of different population subgroups, whether in terms of marital status, economic activity, socioeconomic group, the statuses, tenure types, and in fact, the only groups which actually increased in mobility end of our period were private renters and people in communal housing. Why would that be? Well, one reason probably is there were fewer people living in private rented accommodation or communal housing in 2001 to 20, the first decade. So that group got smaller. It's probably more different population in a change in behaviour and a fall in the rate of movement, quite generally across all sorts of population subgroups. Now the final question is, has population composition shifted towards types of people with traditionally higher or lower propensities of moving? And of course, we know that has changed through time. So here we have the proportion of people in owner occupation in 1971, here in 2000. So there's more people who are occupation in 2000 in 1971. See that some groups of the population have increased. Now, the groups that were green were relatively low mobility groups in 1971 to 81. So the green group. So the growth of owner occupation through time proportionately, because it's a relatively low mobility group in 1971 to 81, might be assumed to lead structurally to decreasing mobility through time. So you're growing a relatively immobile group of the population through time. So that's working to push rates down. But the rise of people with degrees proportional structural factor would expect to push rates up. Ditto the increase in the proportion of divorced people. Ditto the increase of skilled and manual people. So there's some evidence there. Some groups of increase which were mobile, some groups of increase that were relatively immobile. Some groups of this is the sort of decreased side of the ledger here. There's been a fall in the proportion of social renters, relatively immobile. That might actually sort of push the overall mobility rate, migration rate of the population up somewhat. But looking at this, it's a pretty sort of mixed picture. There are some things which are probably going to increase internal migration because of the balance of population change and structure, and some things that are going to push it down. So it's a balancing act. So people are less mobile overall. It seems that changes in behaviour, rate changes are really important. The picture with regard to structural changes in the population is a little bit more mixed. So here are our quick conclusions. Have rates increased or decreased? And how does this differ by distance of move? Down overall, but mainly because of the fall of 10 kilometres or less. How much variation between population subgroups has there been in train rankings since 2000? There's been a lot. It's generally, except for those two cases of private renters and communal. Has population composition shifted towards types of people with traditionally higher or lower propensities of moving? Well, it's gone both ways. And actually, there's no sort of firm conclusion we can necessarily draw from that. So, people are moving less frequently in the past over short distances. This is despite shifts in population composition, where some people have moved into more migratory groups. In fact, it might be that the shift of some people into migratory groups has been offset by the shift of some people, that we should be thinking about this of short distance moving as being the key things to explain what's happening. But is there something happening in the neighbourhoods? Is there something happening in the house market? Is it that some short-term or not happening because of two-earner households? There's a number of different things that we could think to explain, but in this case, we're looking at the drivers of short distance moving as perhaps being the key factors here, which are actually sort of quite important. Long distance movings are different things, and that seems to be sort of keeping fairly steady, fairly level. And hypotheses there would be somewhat different anyway. So a mixed picture, but it's really down to changes in behaviour. We should really be thinking about the causality and the things which drive short distance moves. So just a few quick thoughts maybe then about what we could do afterwards. And this is to explore and entangle the effects of both rate versus compositional changes. And we also try to entangle the balance of factors forcing moves up the population compositional changes and the factors in composition that are forcing it down. So we try to measure the net effects of that in a more rigorous way. And that's really the third paper, which if we can make the revisions that are required, hopefully will be out sometime perhaps early in 2018. So I hope I've not bored you. Thanks for your attention. I can hardly see anything because I've broken glasses and I've only got these pound ones from Pound Stretcher, and I can't really see much of those either.
Thank you very much, Ian. That was very interesting.
Thanks anyway.
Thank you, Ian. That was really interesting. Thank you. It's a very complicated set of data, isn't it? A set of results. But thank you for talking us through that. So now, finally, we're going to hear quickly from Miles Gould, who's based at the University of Leeds, and he's going to be talking about some work using the Northern Ireland longitudinal study, which actually also involved Ian Shuttleworth, and I'll let Miles introduce that for you. Okay, thank you.
Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to Leeds now. And yes, indeed, this is a co-presentation of some work that I undertook with Ian Shuttleworth, who you've just been listening to, and also a colleague of ours, Paul Barr, who
Just a second, Miles, sorry. I think it had been switched to the wrong setting there. Sorry, I'll have to ask you to start again. Is that okay?
Yeah, that's okay. Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to Leeds. So, as Fiona was just saying, this is a co-presentation this afternoon with some work that was undertaken with Ian, who you've just been listening to from Queen's Belfast, and Paul Barr, who was also working at Queen's Belfast at the time, who's now employed at Dartmouth College in the United States. And this is a paper that's been already published in Population, Space and Place, and also in a book that Ian has edited with Chris Lloyd and David Warren. There's also a chapter that's linked to this, and then those references are at the end of this presentation. So what I'm going with, time's moving on a bit this afternoon, so what I'm going to particularly talk about is the project, the data, and just give you a quick flavour of some of the descriptive analysis that's in the paper, just to give you a bit of a flavour of what's included in the paper. I'm just forgetting how to use the technology. So, I'm just going to tell you a little bit of our rationale for the project. I'm going to leave you up our research questions and just say a little bit more about our interest in this particular piece of analysis using the Northern Ireland longitudinal study. So we've got a sort of general interest in a particular social, historical and political context of whether particular communities, here in particular the Catholic community and the Protestant community, have been moving together or possibly moving apart over time, and also more generally, both within this context and more widely, getting a greater, trying to get a better understanding of migration patterns more generally. And we're interested in thinking about areas within the Northern Ireland context which have been gaining or losing population in a period of time post-2001, and I'll explain why a little bit more, because that's to do with the genesis of the data and the data availability when we undertook the research. We're also interested to think about how far internal migration within Northern Ireland sifts and sorts the population and maybe relieves or maybe increases or maybe doesn't change patterns of segregation, thinking particularly in terms of segregation, as I said, in terms of community background, the patterning of the Catholic community and the patterning of the Protestant community, remembering this very particular social, historical, political context and history of conflict that is now at an end, thankfully. And we've also been thinking about patterns of socio-economic segregation as well. So it links to wider work that we're all involved in, thinking about why do people move, where do they move, from where and where to, and what influences those moves as well. So now I'm going to say a little bit more about the data and the genesis of the analysis in this paper. So, for this project, this was one of the early projects to use the Northern Ireland longitudinal study. And this data first became available for the 2001 census, and now more and more data is available. I have a slide to show you that at the moment. So when we undertook the analysis, we undertook an analysis of movements between the 2001 census and forward in time to 2007, because we were also using information about post-2001 census moves, or moves post-2001 census, because the data is linked to health card registrations associated with people being registered with a general practitioner, a family doctor. And because that data is linked to that information, we know about moves from the period 2001 to 2007. There's now more and more NILS data available, so we could repeat this analysis in the future. Now, the beauty of the NILS is, although the Northern Ireland population is quite a small population, the NILS covers about 28% of the population, so it's a very big sampling proportion of the total Northern Ireland population. And it includes people sharing one of sharing some particular birth dates. These birth dates are secret, but 104 out of 365 birth dates represent those people who are included in the NILS. And we had data for this particular study that we undertook for people's records, both on their individual records and the household records collected for the 2001 census, and as I've said already, their post-census movements as well. And we also have information about the local area in which they live, and we've used what are called super output areas, and there's 890 of these in Northern Ireland, and they've been built up from smaller output areas that are used for census dissemination purposes, but we're using the slightly bigger super output areas, which have a population generally between 1,800 and 2,500 residents. Now, the NILS has approximately 500,000 records in it, but our analytical subpopulation that we studied is smaller than that. A little bit more on that in a moment. I'm not going to say very much about the next slide, but the next slide illustrates the structure of the different data sets and databases that are linked together that then result in us drawing data that becomes a particular project. And I'm talking about project number 20, and project number 20 didn't have access to this newer census data. In fact, the census data goes back later than that. I thought I updated these slides earlier today, but I didn't. I seem to have ended up with the wrong diagram. So the data now goes back to 1981 and 1991 and forward to 2011. And we didn't have access to that data because we were involved in the early days of the NILS when it was just the 2001 data. And there's lots of other data coming from other places as well. So there's some valuation data that's also we've also included in some additional analysis that we're not talking about today that tells us a little bit more about the housing stock as well in which these people live in. Right, let's move on. So as Fiona's alluded to already, there you've got my security pass when I go to Northern Ireland and work in the data laboratory. We've been using this data in a safe setting where we have all our outputs checked and approved. And indeed, these slides had to be reapproved today before talking to you as well. So as we've said before, we're focusing on a particular group of people, or study population, and our focus is on people who were in the 2001 census and their movements post-2001 census up till 2007 and so forth. And our study population that we decided to focus on were aged 25 to 74. So we excluded students who have a very different type of residential movement associated with their move to university and possibly multiple moves annually as they change accommodation in each level of their study. So we excluded those from the study, and we also excluded people who were very old, who were perhaps associated with movements to I can't think of the phrase, it's just gone from residential care or hospitals. So we've excluded people who are very old and very young, and we think that's a very sensible thing to do. So I'm now going to talk very quickly, looking at the clock, a little bit of the descriptive analysis that we've undertaken. And the first diagram that I'm going to show you is taken from the paper that I've mentioned already. And this shows that the vast people between 2001 and 2007, about 70% of people included in our analytical population didn't move, and around just over 20% of people just moved once in that period between 2000 and 2007. So for the rest of the analysis, this we thought was appropriate to just focus on no movers and one movers in particular. Now, the next slide is based upon figures 2 and 3 in the final paper. And this takes a little bit of explaining. So what we've got along the graph are a series of deciles 1 to 10. And in the first figure, A, B, and C, in figures 2, A, B, and C, these deciles represent types of places. And places in decile 10 are the most deprived, so these are the most deprived areas. And at the other end of these diagrams, we've got decile 1, which are the least deprived areas. And what we've done in these areas, these are origin areas in 2001. We've looked to see in these areas, these types of areas, these groups of areas. So in these most deprived areas, or the areas with the highest levels of social deprivation, these origin areas, we've compared people in the first diagram with long-term limited illness, that's here, and people have not reported long-term limited illness. And we see that in those decile 10 areas, those are, reminding myself, the most deprived areas, that we see that they have the highest rates of net migration. They're losing population in this period 2001 to 2007. And if we go up the other end of these diagrams, we see in the more highly affluent or the least deprived areas that they're gaining population for both people who report long-term illness and don't have long-term illness. So the patterns are sort of similar across the 10 types of area. And similarly, down here in the lower quadrant, in this lower diagram, which is representing people with no qualifications, the black line, versus people with some qualifications, the grey line. So there are differences. The different types of places, when we compare different types of individual, are losing and gaining populations. And generally in the most deprived areas between 2001 and 2007, if we think of these places as places of origin of movements, they're losing more people than in the more affluent areas. Now, in this final diagram down here in figure 3, the deciles aren't representing socioeconomic deprivation now, they're representing deciles of community background. And here what we're measuring are, in decile number 1 are the least Catholic areas, and decile number 10 are the most Catholic areas. And what we're seeing here for Catholics and Protestants, that it is in the most Catholic areas we are seeing the greatest reductions of population of Catholics compared to Protestants, and up in this other area, in the least Catholic areas, we're seeing more gain of Catholics than Protestants. And if we make a similar comparison, but this time for Catholics and Protestants, going back and thinking about socioeconomic deprivation, we see that the pattern is very similar across the two. The next diagram shows a map, and the only thing to really say about the app, and this is a typology of areas, so different areas, there's a typology, and the areas that are shaded in the brightest green, that's type 1, are areas which gain both Catholics and Protestants through time in terms of net migration between the period 2001, and they tend to be in the most rural area. I'm just looking at the clock and time's moving on. I just want to say a little bit more about, well, I'm just going to flag the next slide. And the next slide thinks about, again, is thinking about our deciles. So again, these are, I'm just thinking about time. We haven't got a lot of time, so I'm going to miss out this slide and move to some key findings, just to summarize all the findings. So all the findings in the paper, some of which I've shown you, some of which I haven't shown you, that generally, as we've seen in the very first slide, that most people do not move. And although I've not talked about the results in any great detail in terms of distance, most people do not move very far. And these moves, in terms of net migration, don't have much effect in terms of social segregation. And basically, we also conclude in the paper that people tend to be less likely to move, or the phrase that we like to use, or Ian coined, which I really like, is this idea of people being more sticky and not moving. It tends to be more the case in terms of community background than social deprivation. But there are differentials in the directions of movement. Try to give you a little bit of a flavour of that today. Indeed, this diagram is a sort of conceptual way of thinking about this. And what we're trying to suggest here, in terms of when we look at these 860 output areas and we look at movements between the period of time 2001 and 2007, people have to move much larger distances to change the type of neighbourhood they live in terms of community background. So if you're a Catholic individual over here, you've got to move considerably larger distances to get to a more Protestant, or get to change your community area, change your area in terms of its community background. But you can actually move much shorter distances to change your community, your local area, in terms of its socio-economic class. So you can be in a Catholic area, and you can move a short distance to move to a low class area. And in fact, in terms of this distinction between having to move quite big differences to change your community background in terms of the neighbourhood's characteristics, I've pressed the wrong button there, I apologise. We also should say, and this is a photograph that Ian has said, that we see quite sharp junctions actually on the ground between these particularly segregated areas in terms of their community background. And in fact, that the junctions are sometimes differentiated by the introduction of what's called a peace wall to separate these two communities as part of the peace process. Right, I'm just going to quickly move on to a few key conclusions, thinking about the time that we have left. Right, so we think that the NILS offered us some really useful insights into very local population dynamics, and we've done this in quite an innovative way, we think, in terms of looking up and down social and community background hierarchies, although I didn't have a lot of time to talk about those second set of findings in the talk today. We think that, or we've demonstrated that moves through deprivation space are strongly structured, but by different factors, tenure, education, and limiting long-term illness, and that's explained a little bit more in the paper. Similarly, in terms of the results, they show that even in post-conflict Northern Ireland, housing moves, yeah, I've said that already. Yeah, okay, I'm just really conscious of the time. Deprivation space is easier to navigate or to move quicker to change the type of neighbourhood in which you live in, and I've probably indicated already. And we think that the clustering approach is methodologically quite useful. I think that's where I'm going to leave it, because I know we're very short of time. So Fiona, I invite everyone back.
Thank you very much, Miles, and I'm sorry we ran out of time there. I understand you may have to leave us quite sharp as well.
In a few minutes, but I'll answer a few questions as required. So
if anyone does have any questions for Miles, could we have those first?
Well, I just need to, what I should have done, of course, is just indicate that I should have shown my acknowledgements and to thank the NILS support unit.
That's fine.
I do apologise for not doing that.
Does anyone have any questions for Miles before he dashes off?
Ian might also chip in as a co-author.
Yes.
Yeah, I can help as well if needed, yeah.
Okay.
So let me just see, are there any questions there, Fiona?
Not for you so far.
Okay.
Martin, if you want to switch on your video again and your microphone, that'd be great. So I'll open the floor then. Thank you to all the speakers. That was really interesting. Thank you very much. And I hope everyone in the audience enjoyed that as much as I did. We had a couple of questions earlier on for Martin. Martin, you're there. So Will had asked about if you could remember the geographical level you used to measure distances.
Yeah, well, I've responded to that in the chat box by pointing them to the original paper. And also, I think to remember, but I have to look up the detail, that we used consistent areas through time. So relatively small areas, but it was quite important to us that these areas were consistent, which is a main problem in doing research using longitudinal data, where the underlying geography keeps changing over time.
Great, great. And Alexandra had asked if you looked at gender differences in the escalator effect.
I think we, oh, you've all disappeared and you...
Okay, we're back again.
Back now? Yeah, I think we did, but I will have to look up the detail, or people can look up the detail themselves.
Okay. Okay, were there any other questions from the audience there? Either about the presentations or about the LSs in general?
If not, that's fine as well.
That's fine. And I should say that the recording for today's webinar will be available on the website, and I shall send out the link for that to you all. And the thematic guide, which goes along with it as well, obviously is still available there. Oops, hang on, we just have one more question here, a couple more questions. Jack Higgins said, thanks for the presentations. Wondering about linkage to hospital episode statistics. I know it exists for Scottish LS, is this the case for England and Wales? I'm afraid not, Jack. We have some pilot studies at the moment which are trying to link ONS with NHS CR data, but at the moment it's very expensive and very time consuming. There's a lot of hurdles to get through. They are trying to make that possible, but I'm afraid at the moment it's not. So they just have cancer registration and some minor event data. And Miles Hill has asked,
Indeed.
Does the mill capture all moves?
So I'm just catching up. I lost my network, so I managed to get back
sorry.
again. So I'm not sure what happened there. We should say that all the moves that are indicated are coming from health card registrations, and Ian's done some other work with Paul in a separate paper that looks at some underreporting, particularly in younger males, if I remember right, Ian, in terms of younger males are more likely, less likely to more frequently register with local family doctors. So all our migration data is coming from the health card registration, so there could be some underreporting.
There is a lag. I mean, there's a fraction of people who never catch up. At any one time, it's about 25% of people wrong place, say, compared to the census. If you do look at the health cards at the census at the same time, about 25% of people are in the wrong place in the health card as compared to where they are in the census. But over the next 6 months or a year, most of those catch up, so there's a lag in reporting. So that's what tends to happen. But there is a small hardcore of people who never get picked up. But in theory, any change up, even if you don't change GP, because if you change address, I mean, if you go to the pharmacist, say, you're going to be asked, you know, what's your address before they give you sort of your medicines and stuff like that. So it should pick everything up, but there is a lag and there is a bit of differential non-reporting.
Thanks, Ian.
Thanks, that's right, isn't it, Miles? Yeah.
Yes, indeed. And Ian and I have been doing some extra work, looking some quite different work, looking at tenure changes and residential moves, and we've been looking at both the responses over time between 2001, and we've been looking simultaneous at both residential movements recorded as per a change of move in the census plus health card registration simultaneously, and also in terms of changes in tenure. So that's some other work, and I think that some of that's already published in John Stillwell's recently published Routledge Handbook of Census and Resources, Methods and Applications, which just so happens to be on the side, and I was reading the title as I looked away.
Great, thanks very much. Okay, I am
flash that there.
Okay, quick advert. I'm conscious of time. Oh, question for Ian. Are there intersectional analysis looking at potential accumulated effects of, say, renters and migrants and their mobility patterns? I'll quickly just say, if anyone does need to leave. Yeah, bye, Miles. Thanks very much. And if anyone else in the audience has to leave, thank you very much, and we'll send out information for the links. If you want to stay for questions, that's fine. Thank you. Bye, Miles.